Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really fascinating lecture that dives straight into the root causes of the wealth gap between nations. If you've ever found yourself wondering why some countries just continuously pull ahead while others struggle to catch up, even after decades of global trade and international aid, well, this is The Explainer for you. We're going to look at the deeply ingrained social, political, and economic variables that actually drive this divide. Let's jump right into it. To really wrap our heads around the modern global economy, we have to start with a fundamental truth. It was captured perfectly by the legendary economist Alfred Marshall in his famous book, Principles of Economics. He states, economic conditions are constantly changing, and each generation looks at its own problems in its own way. What's really fascinating about this quote is how it frames everything we're about to discuss. The speaker of our source lecture uses it to argue that we absolutely cannot rely on old economic doctrines to solve today's problems. I mean, if the world changes, our blueprints for understanding it have to change too, right? We have to update our toolkits to truly understand today's global disparities. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. What exactly are the new economic principles for our generation? How do we address today's unique macroeconomic and microeconomic issues? Think about the everyday challenges hitting us right now. Inflation, unemployment, and even how well our public sector is performing. Can we really solve these massive, complex 21st century issues using 19th century frameworks? Well, the speaker argues firmly that no, we cannot. We need a totally fresh framework, a new lens through which to view human behavior and economic development. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with 1, the need for new principles, then move into 2, the global divide, and map out 3, the 3 key principles. From there, we'll zoom in on 4, unpacking value systems, and finally take a look at 5, the one-way flow of influence. Starting off with Section 1, the need for new principles. The big takeaway here is that relying on outdated economic models is just insufficient, especially when looking at underdeveloped nations today. The speaker argues that our traditional doctrines simply must evolve to solve modern problems. And we're not just talking about ivory tower theories here. We're talking about tangible, everyday realities. We're talking about inflation literally eating away its savings, unemployment stunting generational growth, and public or private sector performance dictating the quality of daily life. A modernized doctrine needs to accurately measure and address the quality and quantity of both public and private sector performance if we're ever going to solve these very real issues. Moving right along to Section 2, the global divide. So the speaker sets up this baseline categorization of the globe to anchor the analysis. On the left, we've got underdeveloped nations, identifying regions like Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, including Iran. And over on the right, we have developed nations, primarily referring to Europe, the US, and Canada. Now, it's worth noting that this structural categorization is actually a pretty standard framework frequently used by international organizations like the World Bank to understand comparative economics. We are looking at this purely structurally to understand the gap. The huge question is, why do these two distinct groups behave so differently when it comes to their economies? That brings us to Section 3, the 3 key principles. Let's trace the speaker's logic step by step here. Step 1 is to simply acknowledge the natural widening gap. It's a fact that the disparity in resource utilization between developed and underdeveloped nations is persistently growing. Then, Step 2 asks us to recognize differences in human resource potential. Now, hold on. It's really important to clarify that when the speaker says human resources here, they absolutely do not mean your corporate HR department. They're actually referring to the complex, deeply rooted mix of a society's race, tradition, customs, and religion. And that flows right into Step 3, which is identifying differing ideological value systems. Basically, the differing human resources in Step 2 directly result in vastly different social, political, and economic behaviors. Let's dig deeper into that with Section 4, unpacking value systems. The speaker introduces this fascinating, highly specific term, the quality of the people. This is the collective combination of qualitative and quantitative economic, social, and political variables in a society. Just to be clear, this doesn't mean the individual traits of a single person. It's referring to the macro-level aggregate of how a society functions as a whole. I want you to think about your own day-to-day life for a second. How do your local customs, your community's traditions, or your specific region's history collectively dictate how people around you spend money, do business, or engage in politics? That collective behavior, the whole shebang, is the quality of the people. So human resources and value systems are directly dictated by a triad of parameters. It's like a giant puzzle. First, you have economic variables, which shape financial traditions. Then you have social variables, which drive cultural norms and customs. And finally, you have political variables, which determine governance and ideology. The unique combination of these three pillars creates the distinct ideological value system of any given nation. This is exactly why you can't just copy-paste an economic policy that works great in Canada and expect it to automatically work in Latin America. The foundational pillars of the value system are entirely different. And finally, Section 5, the one-way flow of influence. To really get the present, we have to rewind a bit and look at the past. The speaker traces the historical roots of this interaction all the way back to the 1700s and 1800s. During this time, there was a massive push by major European nations to find new global territories, which led to the broader discovery and colonization of the Americas and other regions. The speaker argues that this historical period of global expansion laid the permanent groundwork for the directional flow of cultural and ideological influence that we are still seeing today in the 2000s. The speaker visualizes this modern dynamic using a fantastic metaphor: a thick, yellow arrow of influence. Imagine a heavy, dominant flow of cultural and ideological influence pushing directly from the developed world into the underdeveloped world. It constantly impacts how those nations behave economically, socially, and politically. But look at the reverse for a second. The influence going from underdeveloped nations back to developed nations is practically negligible. It's just a tiny, thin line. Basically, the fundamental values of the developed world are aggressively shaping the developing world, and that is constantly widening the gap we talked about back in Principle 1. And that brings us to the ultimate mind-bending question tying this entire explainer together. If the economic gap isn't just about money or raw natural resources, but is actually fundamentally driven by deeply ingrained ideological values and this massive one-way flow of influence, can an underdeveloped society ever truly catch up economically without first completely transforming its core culture? It's a profound, incredibly provocative thought about the true roots of global inequality. So reflect on that triad of value systems and ask yourself how these unseen forces are shaping the world around you today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll catch you next time.